Good afternoon, everybody. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you here today to this RIEL Seminar series and to introduce my friend and colleague Kamal from the Darwin Centre for Bushfire Research. She's here today to talk to us about a very exciting and relatively new area of research referred to as ecosystem services. It's about economics and it's about ecology. So it's a wonderful blend of sciences, and it's all new, and it's about sort of getting rid of the commoditisation of valuing things and thinking about people's well-being and the value of the actual value of that. And she's been very clever at being able to put some numbers and figures around these sorts of things. And she's worked in the last 5 or 6 years with myself. She and I have been working on this project with the Bushfire Natural Hazards CRC, specifically looking at ecosystem services, the payment for ecosystem services, mostly for Indigenous people on Indigenous land. So advancing their employment and academic, etc. opportunities. So I'd like to introduce Kamal to you all today.
Thanks, Andrew. And thanks everybody for joining us today. I hope I tried to make this interesting so that we can all have good discussion towards the end. If I'm going too slow, let me know. So I'll get started that what ecosystem services are. Actually, ecosystem services are not that new. It's just in Australia that we find that this is a new concept. In Europe, this concept has been around, and also in the US for about 30, 40 years now. But it did get popular after Millennium Assessment in 2003. So it has taken quite some time. And now with IPBES, which is Intergovernment Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. So this approach is getting more and more popular in economies that haven't picked it up before. So for some people, it may still be new, but for some, it's one of those things that has been lingering on for quite some time and has been picking up now at a very fast speed. How do I, is this on? It'll be just this button, isn't it? Yeah. So just a quick outline. I'll just provide a little bit of background where I come from and what ecosystem services are and what are the approaches and kind of concepts that we use for valuation, for mainstreaming ecosystem services into policies, decision making, and where we lie in that global space in that context. And then I'll just highlight some of the research opportunities that we got. So quite often, many of you are coming from conservation background. This slide is although a bit old, but I think we are still at the same point where many scientists in conservation science been asking, that biodiversity is so important. We need to do something about this species or something about that species. But the policymakers and the economists and the politicians are thinking what this guy is talking about. So they'll give us a little bit of money to play with things, but in a broad sense, a lot of things go missing. So just a bit of context where I come from. I did my PhD. I originally come from India, from northwest of India, the state of Punjab, where agriculture is the main profession for many people. And we did have that ecological backlash of green revolution, so lots of experiences of that, that what product agriculture can bring in that space. So sustainable development is kind of my focus in that space. In terms of my background, I did my PhD at Central Queensland University back in 2000 when tree clearing was a big issue in Queensland, looking at sustainability of pasture systems. Like any ecologist, I did all those, collected all the ecological data. So I just want to relate with you all so that it's not very different what you guys are doing, assessing, soil properties, plant biodiversity, microbial biomass, and all those kind of things, collecting all that ecological data. I ended up doing this because I didn't have the baseline data to work on the economics of that data. So then I ended up actually doing some financial analysis and also working out some trade-offs because people, as an economist, it's a common concept, we make different choices. So the same with pastoralists, they think whether we should leave this country untouched or we should clear it. So there are certain choices that we make based on our understanding. And in this case, when we looked at clearing silverleaf ironbark country or brigalow or poplar box, so there were different returns, and all the returns were declining over time. So it was quite a good kind of output from that study, thinking whether our returns are sustainable in particularly dollar terms, because that's what mattered at the end to the graziers. So that landed me in this ecological economics space, although I was working in this space before coming to Australia. And when I came here in 1999 for my PhD, I did want to work on, assessing the value of ecosystem services, but then tree clearing being a major issue and ecosystem services were not actually rated highly. I was told that we got plenty of services, we don't need to worry about them. So that's why I ended up working on that very much applied field of tree clearing and pasture production, that kind of area, which actually enriched me in terms of having that local experience. But at the end, my main area is this ecological economics. I'll give you just a very brief feel of what it is like. So in ecological economics, you talk about economics, environment sciences, and also social sciences. But the beauty about this is you work at this intersection. It's about meshing everything up. It's not like, keeping this discipline separate to the others. It's how you mesh it up in a nice way. You blend it up in a way that makes sense for all those three disciplines, or the people working in those disciplines. So that means that you need to come up with some innovative ideas. You do need to come up with some innovative methodologies as well. It's not just applying standard economic techniques to this mix here. It is a very good blend, and it's a very challenging space to work in. And it's very rewarding as well to see what can come out of it. So you feel like, you have achieved something that makes sense, that's relevant. And one of my friends, she works in economics, and she said she always finds people working in ecological economics field are much more, relevant. Their research is much more relevant than compared to those who come either from economics background or environmental economics kind of background, because you can bring that good mix together, making the best, what we call blend. So both ecology and economics have got the same root word or cause, that Latin word, which means house. Zoology means study, economics means management. In a way, both ecology that we all do and economics, they're very much linked. It's how we see them, how we kind of separate them in our this modern kind of thinking, where we are very narrow in our approach. We think ecology is just study of nature or natural systems, and economics is all about money. But it's actually linking the two systems together. They're basically having same origin. So there are three main goals that's been originally set up by the pioneers in this field, Professor Robert Costanza, Herman Daly, and many others. And those goals still stand the same. The main ones are that we should be looking at ecologically sustainable scale for developing or doing things. We should be looking at socially fair distribution, which is about equity, and many of us talk in that space. And we should be looking at economically efficient allocation of resources. So you can think about any one example when we are developing land for agriculture, or we are developing having infrastructure, anything. If we look at those three scales, we can't go wrong, those three principles. So ecological economics at the end, it's about developing economics that's fundamentally ecological in its view. Or in other words, making nature's economics visible. In agriculture sector, with recent IPBES studies, pollination has come up as a major service that contributes to agriculture economy. They're worth about billions and billions of dollars. So it's about how we realize. And same way, you think about your day-to-day living, we depend on nature for basic things. The clothes we wear, the water we drink, and air we breathe. Anything else we can survive, but without these things, we cannot survive, at least air and water. And those things come from nature. So if we don't understand how nature and nature services link to our well-being and our economies, it's very difficult for us to say that we can sustain on this planet Earth. And that's the problem with our modern economies, because our modern economies are pretty much GDP based. So we look at, growth, especially politicians are very much into this kind of thinking where they want to look at GDP figures and the growth has to continue. But slowly with time, there has been some movement where people are thinking more about well-being based economy. That means that we need to actually think what is good for us, how much we need, how many clothes we need together. Where is that limit that we can say enough is enough? So this is not just at the local scale, but as the regional as well as global scale, where we can say, are we satisfied with this level of accumulation of materials? And every material we kind of mine from nature, we are actually taking something out to enhance our own, list of wishes that or needs that we have kind of developed over time. So thinking about how our economy should be, the well-being kind of economy has become quite popular over the last few years. New Zealand has released its first kind of, their treasury has shifted to well-being based economy in their last session. We are still based on GDP economy. Many European countries has been shifting towards this kind of thinking. And I'm happy to talk more about that, but don't want to shift away from ecosystem services, kind of, the topic that we have chosen for today's talk. So ecosystem services are the benefits people obtain from ecosystems. So we all work in that space. The main idea here is that we connect ecosystems with people. So the concept became more popular with the United Nations initiative, which is called Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. It started back in 2000, and they came up with their first framework in 2003. And I was very fortunate to be part of this team at that time, because we were around 1,300 economists, ecologists, social scientists across the globe. And the framework that they produced at that time, although was first of its kind, were first time that this team linked how ecosystems are linking to human economies, and then they focused on human well-being in that sense. I'll talk about that framework in a minute. But we all depend on nature for services. So whether that's recreational services, water, that's my daughter doing some yoga in Kakadu, or whether we swim in those waterfalls. But we don't realize the importance of those things in our well-being. And that's what I'm trying to bring to the forefront in policy decision-making for indigenous communities, where they depend on nature, and it's a lot more invisible economy, and it's probably the same thing is true for many of us, but it's realizing the value, how much we depend on nature, that can help us to advance thinking in that economy space. So ecosystems functions that we are all well aware of represent a subset of interactions between biophysical structures and ecosystem processes that then help the system to deliver ecosystem services. So ecosystem services are the contributions, that are valued by people. So ecosystem functions, you all, I think in the field of ecology, we all study. We all look at those interactions, how biophysical structures interact and what changes happen over time, how land management or different management practices can impact on those ecosystems or their processes and functions. But ecosystem services is one step ahead. It's actually connecting functions with people, the functions which are valued by people. So in an ecosystem, there may be hundreds and thousands of functions happening, but maybe we may be valuing 10% of those functions. So actually thinking those and embracing them in ecology, in economics, is the main part in this ecological economics kind of area. So it's adding people's dimensions. Quite often people think valuing ecosystem services is about monetization or commodification, but it's actually not that. It's much more than that. It's not just about commodifying ecosystem services. It's more about, how we can actually understand the role of nature that nature plays in our economies. So quite often from economic perspective, we don't get how we as human beings depend on nature for different things. So even at this time, we're all, breathing good air. So nature is not issuing us any invoices saying, hey, you pay this much. But if we sit, in a multinational kind of corporation kind of setting, quite often we'll get, you need to attend this conference, this is how much you will pay. This is the food you're getting, this is how much you will pay. So it's this valuing ecosystem services exercise is more about informing our policies, informing future funding programs, that we embrace the role of nature in our economic decision making. So previously, the basic theory of economics is that we should be considering the limiting factors for development. So we had human labor as a limiting factor, we had technology as a limiting factor, but now many people are claiming, especially scientists in this ecological economic space, we've got nature as a limiting factor these days. We've got enough of development. We should be thinking how we can continue to survive on this planet Earth. How can we sustain functions that we are doing? So if we think that nature and nature's functions are becoming limited, then we should be more considerate about those when developing our economy. So I'll talk a little bit about ecosystem services frameworks, which inform those valuation techniques. And some of the original ones are proposed by a good colleague and friend of mine, is Dolf de Groot from the Netherlands. These people has been, along with Professor Robert Costanza and others, they've been the pioneers in advancing this ecosystem services approach back in 90s, 2000s. So he proposed very early on, you can say this is about 20 years back now, but one of the frameworks that I like, and it clearly explains how ecosystem functions linked with services, and that's why I wanted to bring it here. I thought that may be a good starting point for especially students who are thinking in this space to see how ecosystem structure and processes linked with ecosystem functions. So for example, regulation of climate or habitat, and then how those ecosystems deliver those goods and services. So when I say ecosystem services, that includes both goods as well as services. It's a common definition that's been well perceived. So out of those goods and services, some have got ecological value, that we say some intrinsic values. The others are having social cultural values or the economic values, depending how we value them. And then you get a total value, and that's what helps in decision making. However, this kind of frameworks have been expanded on. It's just a good way to think how ecosystem structures and processes deliver functions, and then those functions help us to achieve some, obtain some ecosystem goods and services. The another one being proposed by Marion and Roy, which is more like a cascade, that how biophysical structures, they interact to deliver some function, to have getting some processes and functions happening in the system, and that delivers some service. Out of those services, some have got those benefits, which we call contributions, but we value only a few of those benefits. So with time, Dolf and others have expanded this. They included this dimension, which we call institutions and human judgments determining services, and it has become a big thing now with Millennium Assessment and also with IPBES. What kind of valuation systems we should be setting up, what kind of institutions we should have that would help us to interpret the importance of ecosystems and nature in terms of running our economies. So what they said is that we got these biophysical structures. So again, I'm just reiterating that this kind of frameworks has been developed by ecologists, who moved on, like myself, into this economics field a little bit over time. So how these functions, they deliver services, and then they linked a little bit more with human well-being. So this has become much more stronger, area of thinking, but also over time, what kind of governance is in place to understand the role of services that flow from nature and the value of those services. So that's the area that I'll be focusing on. The Millennium Assessment Framework that was delivered by the MA, the United Nations Initiative, back in 2003, was the first one that highlighted that how 4 categories of ecosystem services actually link with different constituents of human well-being. So the 4 categories, as you probably many of you would have seen this framework, the provisioning services, regulating services, cultural services, and the base of those, the column, that's why it stands here, is those supporting services, which are more or less a lot of those the functions that play a key role in this. And that's why when it comes to valuation, we value mostly provisioning, regulating, and cultural services. And how these services link with constituents of well-being, they carefully chose those 5 constituents, which is linking about security of resources. Like for us, we all feel like we need to have, secure access to food, or we need to have a security of accessing good air, natural resources, and water. And same way, linking those services with basic materials for good life, having good food, water, health, how we feel well, how we got access to, good water and air. Social relations, this is quite important, quite often it's been ignored. When we think about good social relations, these are also, we need to think about things where we relate with each other because of nature. So you go to a camping place and you meet with other friends out there. So nature is playing a big role for bringing people together. So how nature is actually helping us to connect with each other. And this is so true for many indigenous and local communities, and probably farmers as well. How they connect with their land, how they connect with their systems in place, then that actually helps them shape their cultural norms and practices. And overall, this freedom of choice and action, this particular component of well-being comes from Professor Amartya Sen's approach, which is a capability approach. If you would have ever had a chance to read his book, he's a Nobel laureate in economics. And he brought this approach, what we call capability approach. And one of the key elements in that approach is that people should have freedom of choice and action. Means that if we got a freedom that we can visit Kakadu the time we like, the days we like, it enhances people's well-being. It's a big thing when we talk about some of those countries where there are so many restrictions in place. Here we live in a free democratic world, so we probably don't experience that restriction that much compared to many other countries where there are restrictions in place. For many indigenous and local communities, that's a big component when we think about their freedom to action and choice, because they often do not have access to land, or if they have access, they may not have proper right to do things that they want to do. So native title rights in Australia is a good example in that space. So with the Millennium Assessment, then we rolled on to this IPES, which is Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity, Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And they produced this first framework. The only thing that they changed that the ecosystem services kind of terminology to nature's contribution to people. So they call it NCP. And rather than saying ecosystems, they said nature. So you can see that different terminology being in place. But rest of the things like institutions and governance and the direct drivers, they also been highlighted in the Millennium Assessment Framework. It's more, softening that scientific language, so it's more appealing to the public. But both these frameworks, they highlight just one-way relationship. It's from ecosystems people driving their benefits. There's a one-way relationship, we as humans driving those benefits from nature. Same with IPBES. Their framework is also having good quality of life, having nature's benefits to people, and nature is giving those benefits. It's one-way relationship. I'll come to this point because actually we got two-way relationship with nature, and this is so true for many indigenous and local communities. When people drive their benefits, they also think that what's our responsibility to look after country. And that's the kind of concept we all need to absorb. In a very Western setting, we think about what nature is giving to me, and that's where the ecosystem services concept has evolved. What I'm trying to argue is actually we need to expand our thinking. We need to think two-way, but we can give back to nature for obtaining its benefits. So from indigenous and local communities, there is a lot to learn in that space when we talk about this two-way relationship, because people often think if country is not well managed, they feel sick. So their well-being is affected directly. But there is also that same way of biophysical ecosystem services that we drive from ecosystems, social cultural benefits. Along with that, there is another component which I call capabilities, following Saint's capability approach. Because many indigenous communities living on land, experiencing, work with their elders, they develop a lot of capabilities they're learning being on country. And quite often that's not valued. So what I'm trying to argue in our research is that capabilities are a key component when we are talking about these frameworks, and we should be actually embracing this more widely in valuing ecosystem services. So the same way, this kind of framework shows that actually country is source of opportunities. It gives so much to people. So because of access to country, people are able to develop their capabilities. So there are a range of well-being benefits, and how this kind of diagram, it shows the whole continuum, how country, considering that as a source of opportunities, delivers some ecosystem services, which enhances people's well-being. And if we measure them properly, we can inform policy decision-making. And that actually informs this line of life, which means that country is like the means for living. So if we look after our resource base, we will be able to sustain our well-being. So that's where this all comes from. So I'll quickly provide this case study of Fish River Station, which many of you may be aware of. So along with assessing social cultural benefits, so we assessed capabilities for the Daly River community that actually work for the rangers and other TOs who work on this country, looking at applying the standard approaches, which is, I don't want to go in detail, like how we value them. Happy to have another session or workshop on that, those valuation techniques, because they're complex and there is a bit of economics to it. So I don't want to kind of bore the audience in that space. But what is useful here is that when we apply the standard approaches in assessing the value of ecosystem services, there are great databases such as this CHEAP, which is the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity, that has got more than 1,350 studies across the globe on different ecosystems, telling value of different ecosystem services from different parts of the world. So Dolph and his team has done this great work, and this database is freely available online. So using that database, which many people use in that ecological economics space and ecosystem services space to value ecosystem services, we can come up with these high, like really, big figures. $84 million, the ecosystem services that they're worth from managing Fish River Station. But we wanted to do some meaningful assessment that would make sense to people in the NTE and also our policy decision makers. So for that, we looked at well-being benefits. looking at the government expenditure on improving well-being of indigenous people who access that country, the capability benefits, that they have developed their capabilities, that they're able to do things being on country, managing their country in their ways. And we looked at some socio-cultural benefits. So altogether, those benefits are about $2.2 million a year. And then we also looked at, the carbon credits are marketable, which are tangible. And they vary year to year, depending on their carbon price, but they're about $500,000 as well. So you can say that the total value is about $2.5–3 million a year, just fish devastation for managing it well. So just highlighting on that capabilities, that for example, people know about bush food and medicine, but knowing where that bush food and medicine comes from, how to process it, and how to actually pass it on to others is a skill. And that's what I'm arguing in these frameworks, that indigenous people and local communities have got that knowledge, and we should be actually much more considerate about that knowledge. And many farmers have got that knowledge too in that space. Quite often that's been missed. So we expanded that capability approach in that ecosystem services space and did this case study in Western Ghats of India, where we tested it, we tested questions around it, and we expanded that capability framework, that thinking about capabilities are where people are able to do things. So for example, I'll just try to explain this a bit more. Capabilities are where we are able to do things. Okay, so like we are all well educated, we are able to measure soil carbon, we are able to look at biodiversity and say something about it. So that's our capability. Functioning is the opportunity to be what you would like to be. It's that ability that you can achieve something. So for example, I got this knowledge in ecosystem services. If I don't have an opportunity to work in this space, it's just a capability, it's not my functioning. So functioning is where when I got the opportunity and I'm able to achieve something out of it. That's what makes it happen. Utility is where my well-being is satisfied. I feel good working in that space. So it's the same for anyone working on country or we are working in our profession. So those capabilities play a key role. But the idea behind this is that the governments should understand that they need to provide the right kind of opportunities for people so they can realize their capabilities, so they can materialize those capabilities into functionings, so they can achieve their well-being. Is it becoming too complicated? Yeah. So like I said earlier, that country offers opportunities for people. And having access to country enables many rangers to work on country. So that's, they can achieve their functioning and they can achieve satisfaction, which is their utility, So, and that utility is well perceived in economics. So then we can easily link it with the way people see, like the policy decision makers. So you can show that this is how well-being being achieved, and this is how much this opportunity is valuable. So the argument is that if we got the right kind of opportunities developed, then we can have the right output in terms of well-being. So significance of ecosystem services and doing those value assessments that we can directly inform many public policies. Especially in Australia, when you work with indigenous communities, there is such a crossover between health, education, many domestic violence kind of policies. And we see that people working on country, there is so much, other benefits. It's not just that they are working on country to manage that country to deliver those ecosystem services. So working across, sectors, it's a bit challenging, but also beautiful that you learn new things. It can help us to highlight how human well-being is dependent on nature, because quite often we don't realize our day-to-day dependence on nature. So it helps us when we are either putting some dollar values or non-dollar values. So economics is not all the time about dollar and non-dollar values. There is a huge literature in economics about welfare economics, which is beyond monetary dollar values. So it can help us how we realize our dependence on nature. It helps us to highlight the importance of indigenous people and local communities managed lands. You know, that so far, when we look at the bigger picture, quite often people will say, we don't get much out of this because people are just sustainably managing it for their own livelihoods. But when you look at the bigger picture, people managing at that scale, actually, they're sustainably managing that land, especially many farming communities in the Asia Pacific. They're not exploiting the resources, but they're managing to sustain their livelihoods. By doing that, they're actually enabled to deliver a lot of ecosystem services for the well-being of many other people in their region as well as across the globe. If we think that the way the Western world have developed, a broad kind of agriculture, which is totally driven by economic profits, then we won't be able to sustain, the supply of ecosystem services and the way our systems run to sustain our systems or agroecosystems that could help, all of us sustain on this planet. So there is a huge, benefit for indigenous peoples and local communities managing their lands the way they manage, which the other sectors need to realize in this space. And through this ecosystem kind of approach, you can highlight that. And it also helps to attract more investment in managing natural resources, more or less in conservation. So we just got this paper accepted in Ecology and Society, which is actually exactly highlighting the role of indigenous peoples and local communities in effective and equitable conservation. And this one is more about, if anyone likes to have a copy, I'm happy to pass it on, more about how in Australia we can actually redirect some of our welfare expenditure into creating opportunities on country for indigenous people so they're able to work on their country. And by doing that, they're delivering ecosystem services, not just for themselves, for many of us, and also people down in South. So globally, ecosystem services economy is worth about $36 to $42 billion a year. So it's a huge economy. And it's growing very fast. The sectors that can benefit from this is indigenous and local communities managed lands, agriculture land use where we are sustainably managing lands. Australian government has put last year a big, what we call biodiversity stewardship program. They funded about $32 million over 4 years to invest in developing biodiversity credits on farming lands. Pastoral sector for sustainably managing pastoral lands. So our idea is if we can develop the right kind of incentivized mechanisms, which we call payments for ecosystem services, then we can actually manage our natural resources much more efficiently. At a global front, business front, the United Nations have got this finance initiative. It started back in 1992. And they've been working with banks, insurers, and investors so that we can create a sustainable future. And that initiative has been picking up. Last year, they had their meeting and about 560 businesses actually signed up that we want to actually have these nature-based solutions. And those businesses are worth about $4 trillion a year, their return. And they're actually asking that more and more of these stewardship arrangements, they want in place so they can invest in those opportunities. Because at the moment, many companies, they extract resources, and those are all public resources, and they exploit the resources for their own private benefits. So there is a big difference between private benefits and public benefits, and nature being treated more or less like as a public asset, where many in the society don't realize what we are losing. But over time, when we see the ecological backlash, then we are paying for fixing that problem. So many of us, we pay that taxpayers' money to fix problems with mining, to fix problems with other developments, and we don't realize what we lose when those developments are in place. So actually internalizing those externalities is a key thing that we can work out through this ecosystem services kind of approach. So early this year, there being this Economics of Biodiversity report produced by the UK government. It's been led by Sir Partha Dasgupta. He's the key economist, and he went on, this report went quite wide across the globe, and he gave a few webinars early this year. One of the things that he's been saying in this report is, coming from that economics background, he's saying, we do not have even a minute now to think about, we should be putting nature at the top for any investment. And that's been taken up widely by many conservation organizations, many investors, corporate organizations, and the governments in Europe. Coming back to indigenous peoples and local communities managed lands, because that's where I love to work. If we change our investment patterns, we can actually achieve a lot more holistic development, and we can address many of those sustainable development goals, which the UN has been highlighting. Out of 17, easily 9 we can easily achieve, creating work opportunities on country, having good health, well-being of people. Climate action indirectly will be directly addressed. And at the end, I just wanted to highlight, I'm on time, Fiona? Okay, so I just wanted to see that there are some potential research projects. I wanted to use this opportunity just to highlight some of the things, that there is a PhD scholarship to work on ecosystem services, possibly linking ecosystem services and well-being of indigenous communities in the North, mapping and assessing ecosystem services on indigenous lands globally. We've been thinking about this project for quite some time. Masters, possibly. Documenting farmers' experience in organic farming, where they work hard to sustain their land, but they don't get any credits for that. So if we can document their experiences and also assess some ecosystem services for them managing their land, I think we can tap into that biodiversity credit scheme, where they should be credited for doing things in the right way. Developing a sustainability framework for farming systems, where we can measure natural, human, social, and production capital, not just the production capital as is the the main kind of way of doing things. If we look at the holistic picture, then it helps the society as well as the farmers to achieve sustainable goals. Many farmers doing things in the right way, if they're doing it sustainably, I think then the society can realize those things as well. So there should be that two-way, flow of information, understanding that things are happening sustainably, and we can develop resilient local economies in that space. Or assessing ecosystem services from Takrir National Park or some IPAs. I think that's just the possible titles that came in my mind. So thank you very much for listening. Any questions? We can have good discussion.
Thank you, Kamal. Another few terms I learnt today. And thank you very much. How do we get to the chats? Chat. I'll just turn that on. Okay. If anybody online would like to pose a question to Kamal, we can see the chat window at the moment. So anybody in the room got a question? Fiona, please. Hang on, I'll give you the mic.
Just when you were talking, Kamal, I was thinking about people being removed from country with past government policies, and I wondered, with your work, would there be any way to sort of look at the cost of that policy?
I think that's a really good idea, because one way to compare it is looking at the value of those who are actually being able to work on their country and achieve their well-being. So one way we are doing it is assessing ecosystem services from these carbon projects. So we recently submitted a revised paper to ecosystem services in that space, assessing the total value of ecosystem services from indigenously managed carbon projects. So that indirectly highlights, but I think the other angle is to look at the costs, which we can talk, I think about. Yeah.
And a new thing that I've heard you talk about, and it's mentioned in the paper you're talking about, and I've heard it elsewhere recently too, is this whole notion of opportunity values. Is that the term? Opportunity values?
Opportunities, yeah.
Yeah. And how, for instance, in the Savannah burning, there are all these properties that could be involved in Savannah burning and they're not, because they're not, there's we can value that, and how that's a part of the economy that's missing because they're not taking up the opportunity. Yeah. Is that the kind of style of analysis that you'd be undertaking to look at, as Fiona mentioned, people being taken off country?
I think so. That would be a good one to do. What's the potential there to develop that economy? At this stage, we got the opportunity, but that opportunity hasn't been captured. So we can see what will be the value of engaging those people in that carbon economy space to develop that, to realize that economy.
Yeah.
Yeah. And one of the things in this space is like carbon economy has actually, demonstrated that people can work on country and actually have some economic gains, the real economic gains. And this is what led us to think about this ecosystem services kind of economies, that if carbon is one side, having greenhouse gas emissions abatement, which of course came from, national thinking, but ecosystem services is a much broader way of thinking that, yes, that's one service that delivers us some value. But there are many other services by managing fire on their country. They're also delivering biodiversity benefits. There are also many social and cultural benefits that should be accounted for. And that's where we are looking at, the mix of all those ecological and social cultural benefits that remote communities obtain, managing fire on their land. So that's the real opportunity in that space. Quite often people think, this is the total value of ecosystem services. That means that someone is going to invest in that. But of course, that's not the case, because the natural systems come with their inherent structures and functions in place. We haven't created everything in that space. But managing those natural systems requires human effort. And the management cost is the one that we should be paying people for, and looking at what is needed for people to manage their country so they can sustain that land for themselves as well as for many others.
Anybody else here? I can't see anything popping up online. Oh no, there's a question there for you, Kamal. Karen Gibb. Are advances being made in calculating water credits so there might eventually be a framework for dollar calculations derived from real data?
Thanks, Karen. I'm not so aware of in water credits. I know that, is it Green Collar been doing that in reef catchment in Queensland? And the way they're doing is they're looking mostly reducing the flow of nutrients to the reef, reducing soil erosion to the reef. They got 3 things in place. And then they convert those things into dollar values to fix those problems. So one of the things that I find a bit frustrated with this approach is quite often we pay people who have created the problem, and we pay them for fixing that problem. But we never credit those people who have done things in a wrong way, who have done things in a right way. So the government approach so far, even for that water credits in the reef, it's still focused on fixing the problem. Even the earlier reef credits were focused on, fixing soil erosion for many farmers in that catchment. So who can actually stop soil erosion, soil nutrients getting to the reef? But at that time, even 10 years ago, I used to say, why can't we pay who are doing good things on their land? And we haven't still gotten there. Yeah.
Yep.
And that's one thing, I think with biodiversity credits, the new scheme, which is about $32 million over 4 years. I guess if we can develop some sort of that mechanism where we can credit people who are doing right things on their farms, I think we can be far ahead where we are now.
Yeah. No, that's great. You can see how a lot of what you're proposing really just changes the paradigm, of taking away the idea that everything's a commodity and valuing it as something more personal. And, that term, I must say, when you were first using it, well-being, a number of years ago, I'm like, that's just, what the hell's that? And I'm like, why is that in a scientific paper? That's crazy. But now I completely agree, and I completely value what you're saying about it, that well-being. So really what it should all be hanging on, right, rather than anything else. Any other questions here today? All right, we might wrap it up. Thank you, Kamal.
Thank you.
That's great.
Thanks, everybody.